We're going to continue our study of Genesis tonight, and in a sense, what we've done up to this point, I did have that one message that talked about the significance of clothing throughout Genesis, but other than that, we've kind of been proceeding expositionally through Genesis 1 through 11, and in one sense, Genesis 1 through 11 is almost prehistory from the perspective of the Jews, Judaism, Israel, things of that nature. I'd like to summarize what we've done so far and then let us move ahead. So in chapter 1, we had the grand overview, the formation of the heavens and the earth. And then this is followed. And of course, at the end of chapter 1, God creates mankind and tells them to be fruitful and multiply. But then in chapter 2, what we get is a more detailed treatment, specifically of how God formed mankind. And of course, he gave them one rule. That's it. You can do anything you want, just one rule, which of course we promptly proceed to fail in chapter 3. And keep in the back of your mind that if it was you or I there, we would have done exactly the same thing. So then we see that having succumb to the temptation, then our sinful nature then is something that gets inherited after that. Adam and Eve, notice that Satan, in the form of the serpent, gave them the temptation, put the bug in their ear, so to speak, to say that, hey, God's holding out on you. You should have that fruit. Oh, think about that. So he provides the temptation that they then fall for, hook, line, and sinker, despite God's command. But what we see in chapter 4, Satan doesn't show up, does he? Mankind sins all by himself. And here in the second generation, you've got murder already. So then in chapter 5, we see the lineage from Adam to Noah, and we saw the long lifespans. We saw Enoch being raptured straight to heaven because he walked with God. And then, of course, we have the story of the flood. After that, then the beginning of the nations, then the Tower of Babel, and then Shem, to the lineage from Shem to Abram. We've gone through all of this. We can consider broadly, and different commentators divide Genesis in different ways, but one way you can think of it is in 4 parts, where chapter 1 is the origin of the universe, chapters 2 through 5 are the origins of man, chapters 6 through 11 are the origins of the nations. And then chapters 12 through 50 are the origins of Judaism and the state of Israel. So we have, in one sense, covered the first 3 parts. Some commentators make it 2 parts. It's 1 through 11 and then 12 through 50. So it's like before Judaism and after Judaism. That's a perfectly valid way of looking at it as well. However you want to slice it, 1 through 11 is leading up to, or another way of thinking of it is narrowing the focus from the universe, the earth, to mankind, proliferation of the nations, and then all the way down to single family, which will then, of course, give rise to an entire nation. Now, what I want to do this evening is briefly cover a whole bunch of the next part, chapters 12 through 27, which of course focused primarily on Abraham, Isaac, and their families. And then I'm going to close the message by focusing on a part of the story that doesn't always get as in-depth treatment as maybe it should. So let's go through quickly, relatively quickly, go through this chunk of Genesis. So what happens and I am going to assume that the majority of the folks in the audience have already read through this multiple times. Certainly, if this is an unfamiliar story to you, I wholeheartedly recommend that you read through Genesis on your own. But I'm going to assume some familiarity here. So in chapter 12, Abram is called by God. Now, you go back to the end of chapter 11, we see that Abram's father, Terah, left Ur of the Chaldees and goes to Haran. Different commentators argue about this, but the view I take is that Abram was the one called, and of course that's supported by Stephen's speech before the Sanhedrin in Acts chapter 7. He was called when he was in Ur of the Chaldees. Why did they stop in Haran? Was that part of the plan or not? We're not going to get into that this evening. He stops in Haran, stays there for a while. Eventually his father dies, and then he continues with the plan. He goes to Canaan. As John read earlier, God makes this unilateral covenant. When you look at Genesis 12, just like back the covenant that God made with Noah, said, look, I'm not going to flood the earth again. And no matter what mankind does, I'm not going to do that. It required no obedience on mankind's part. In chapter 12, God says, look, come out of your country, your family, go to the land I'll tell you. I will bless you, and all nations of earth will be blessed through you. Now, we read this part already. I can see this text is a bit small. Apologize about that. But what do we see? And we read this a little earlier. Go out from your country, your relatives, your father's household to the land I'll show you. I'll make you into a great nation. I'll bless you. I will make your name great so that you will exemplify divine blessing. I will bless those who bless you, but the one who treats you lightly I must curse. So that all the families of the earth may receive blessing through you. So Abraham left just as the Lord had told him to do. Now, it's worth pausing for a moment to remember that what was it they were trying to do at the Tower of Babel? Let's make a name for ourselves. And when God had told them to disperse and populate the earth. So here, God's saying, I am going to make your name great. Totally different deal. God can make your name great for his name's sake. Not we don't do it out of our own selfishness. What did you see at the very end of the verse there, verse 2. So Abram left just as the Lord had told him to do. And I think it was, 2 weeks ago, Pastor talked about Genesis chapter 22 and Abraham's, command from God to sacrifice Isaac. And Pastor talked about the fact that Abram was in the habit of knowing God's voice. This wasn't some mysterious thing in the back of his brain that was significant of mental illness or something like that, or somebody behind the bushes telling him to do stupid stuff. No, God had manifested himself to him multiple times, and Abram knew God's voice. Nevertheless, it doesn't start off particularly smoothly. He obeys, he goes to Canaan, and then what happens? There's a famine in the land. All right? Now, just because he went down to Egypt doesn't necessarily mean that in and of itself was disobedience. Now, we don't see that God or that Abram called out to God looking for wisdom on what he should do in the midst of this famine. You can argue it either way. What's clear, though, is it wasn't necessarily going down to Egypt that was the issue. The issue was him lying about his wife. We're going to come back to that. All right, what happens afterwards? Well, he comes back to the land, and he and Lot's possessions have grown to the point where they can't both have their herds in the same place. Abram says, hey, Lot, pick whatever you want. Lot picks what looks like the best for him, which, as we know, turned out not to be a good idea because it put him right next to Sodom and Gomorrah, but he goes on, and in fact, in chapter 14, what happens? Well, Lot ends up getting caught in the middle of this war. He gets carried off as spoils of victory, and then Abram has to come in and rescue him. Remember, in the wake of that this interesting fellow named Melchizedek comes and blesses Abram. What we're seeing in the painting here is where Melchizedek is bringing out bread and wine, which of course was a prefiguring of the Passover, which was a prefiguring of Christ's sacrifice, which is a prefiguring of what we're going to celebrate tonight. What happens next? Chapter 15. God appears to Abram again, promises his future blessing, and makes a covenant. Because what did Abram say? Chapter 15 is where God makes a promise, and then arguably one of the most important verses in the entire Bible, Abraham believed, and God credited to him as righteousness. But then Abram says, but how can I know? Can you give me some assurance? He's not doubting God, but he's saying, can I have some assurance? So what does God do? God creates a covenant with Abram. And if you're not familiar with the culture at the time, they didn't have courthouses where copies of contracts could be recorded. So, written records weren't the thing they are today. So when you, in that era, when you were making a contract, they called it cutting a covenant. Why did they call it cutting a covenant? Well, it's because you took animals, you cut them in half, and you walked between the pieces, basically saying, if I don't live up to my end of the bargain, may I be treated like these animals. And it was referred to as cutting a covenant. And normally, both parties in the contract would pass through the pieces, and it would be done in the presence of witnesses, and everybody would know what was going on. What happens in chapter 15? If you read through the story, you'll see that God manifests himself in the form of this smoking pot and flaming torch. But what happens? God is the only one who goes through the pieces. Abraham's just watching. And that's significant because, again, it means it's a unilateral covenant. God is making a promise, and Abraham and his descendants don't have to lift a finger to make it happen. That's really important. We're going to come back to that shortly. But it's still not smooth. What do we read in the next chapter? 10 years in the land, God's promised that you, Abraham, are going to have a son, and Sarah is still barren. So they get this bright idea to take matters into their own hands. Of course, now, we would never do something like that, right? Right? Big guffaw from the entire audience. We'll come back to that one as well. Next chapter. We're seeing peaks and valleys in kind of faithfulness and obedience here. Next chapter, 17. God appears to Abram again, gives him the covenant of circumcision. And if you read through the chapter, what you see is that Abraham obeyed God on that very day. I'm not going to get into any of the details, but let me tell you this. That's about as close as a man is going to come to the pain of childbirth. And Abraham didn't delay. He obeyed instantly. And the other thing is, every male in his household did it too, which I find that almost miraculous. So clearly a high point in Abraham's obedience and faithfulness. So then what? Well, then we get the three visitors, which was the pre-incarnate Jesus and two angels. And they come and visit Abraham and basically say, hey, Sarah's going to have a son. And she laughs like, yeah, right. And God calls her out on it. And then she freaks out and he says, nope, you, that's what you said. Then Abram goes on and pleads for Sodom, showing his mercy, his pleas for mercy. But of course, what happens? Well, God rescues Lot and his family, and then proceeds to destroy all the cities of the plain there. Also a prefiguring of the end times that are yet future to us. Then what? Down into a valley again. What happens? Abraham and Abimelech. Abraham didn't seem to learn the lesson from the first time that God would take care of him. We're in the same boat. We do this all the time. We know that God's going to protect us or save us or provide for us, and yet we still make mistakes and falter and stumble. Well, that's exactly what happened with Abimelech. Then, finally, Isaac is born. The promised child has been born. Well, Ishmael starts mocking Isaac. Sarah says, I'm not having any of this. And Hagar and Ishmael get sent away. End of the chapter. Abraham makes a peace treaty with his neighbors. Why do I have 7 sheep there? Well, remember those 7 ewe lambs were the significance of the treaty there. Then, the biggest test of Abraham's life, which of course was what Pastor was talking about a couple of weeks ago. Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the place I will show you and sacrifice him to me. And of course, we know the end of the story. God had no intention of having Abraham kill Isaac, but he wanted to make absolutely certain, and Abraham needed to know it for himself, that Abraham held God above his own family. Yes, God wants us to love our families, but not above God. And that was Abraham's ultimate test, which of course he passed with flying colors. Well, at some point then, Sarah passes away. We have the incident where Abraham has to buy a burial place. He's been in the land he was 127, which meant he was 137, so 37 plus 25, 57, 62 He's been in the land 62 years at this point, and he's still a nomad. We're not going real fast here with this program, are we? One child, no land. Keep that in mind when you think God's slow in keeping his promises. God's timetable isn't ours. And you have the whole back and forth between Abraham and the Hittites. And of course, at the end, he buys the field and the cave, which he and Sarah and Isaac and Rebekah and others are buried in. Then what happens? In the wake of Sarah's death, Abraham decides it's time for Isaac to get a wife. And so Abraham sends a servant to Haran. I'm probably going to cover this in a message subsequently if the Lord allows, and I may incorporate it into a later part of Genesis. But the fact of the matter is, when you read through Genesis 24, you see that somehow, although it's not in the text, somehow Abraham very successfully witnessed to his servant, because his servant is more faithful, frankly, than most of his grandchildren. And we'll talk about that later. But anyway, that, of course, that whole incident goes swimmingly. And what happens? Rebekah comes back with the servant to marry Isaac. But at this point, we still have, maybe a 40-year-old Isaac. Actually, he was 40 years old. And all that he and his dad own are a burial plot so far. And then what happens? For 20 years, Rebekah doesn't get pregnant. We've seen this movie before. Interesting. But Isaac prays, and God responds. But Rebekah says, "What's all this struggling going on in my tummy?" And God says, "There's two nations in your tummy, and you're going to give birth, and the older will serve the younger," et cetera, et cetera. So, sure enough, that happens. Now, you have to read the text to figure this out, although the text shows Abraham's death earlier, but it turns out Abraham actually died about 15 years later. And of course, both Isaac and Ishmael bury him. But then what do we read? We read that Esau, same chapter, we read that Esau sells his birthright. Would you sell your inheritance for a cup of soup? He's roundly criticized for this in the Bible. It gives you some indication about his attitude and his behavior. Then later, what happens? The third incident of, "Oh, she's my sister." Now, some commentators will say this was the same story, just repeated a couple of different ways. Not that I said commentators, that was being too kind to them. Some skeptics say that it's the same incident, it's repeated twice. Of course, we believe that the Bible is inspired and inerrant, and so these were three separate incidents. What it shows you is that sin patterns, deeply seated sin patterns, keep repeating. And in our own lives, we can see that there are certain sins that we have a hard time stopping than others. And in fact, in this case, apparently Isaac heard the story, didn't quite get the message that, hey, God's going to protect you, wasn't fully engaged in that. And, in the third incident of, "Oh, she's my sister." Well, in the wake of that, God blesses Isaac, so much so that the Philistines are getting jealous and they fill up all the wells that Abraham had dug, and the rest of the chapter is him, moving on, and then they'd claim a well, and then he'd move on, they'd claim the well, and finally at the end, he has peace with his neighbors. And this whirlwind overview of this section, I'll wrap up by talking about the third of the patriarchs, Jacob, who starts his journey by stealing his brother's blessing. When Esau sold his birthright for a cup of soup, that perhaps was, you could say Jacob was taking advantage of him, and Jacob wasn't very nice, and Jacob wasn't being very brotherly, but Esau did it with his own free will and knowing that he was just being impetuous. However, when Jacob steals Esau's blessing, there's nothing righteous in it whatsoever. It was outright deception and theft. And this is how the patriarchy is starting. I've often said that the Bible, particularly the Old Testament, it has to be real. Nobody would make this stuff up and make it their historical documents for their people. It's too embarrassing. If you go through the ancient world and the records that the kings kept, funny how they would kind of not talk so much about their defeats. They'd talk about their victories, and the defeats they didn't bother writing down, or if they did, they'd spin it in such a way that it would look good for themselves. You don't see that with the Old Testament. It's all there, warts and all. So with that background, what I would like to spend the remainder of the message talking about is when faith falters. There has been certainly a lot of discussion about Abraham's faith, which we rightly mention. His obedience is something that's extremely important as an example for us. But there are some lessons that we can learn from the failures. And so let's go through this. Back to chapter 12, back to the first, "Oh, she's my sister" incident. Chapter 12, starting in verse 10. There was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt to stay for a while because the famine was severe. As he approached Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, "Look, I know that you are a beautiful woman. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'This is his wife.' Then they will kill me, but will keep you alive. So tell them you are my sister, so that it may go well for me because of you, and my life will be spared on account of you." You have to stop and think. You presume that the two of them had an exit strategy, because neither one of them wanted to stay there. So presumably, now it was of course wrong for Abram to think that he was going to get killed, because God had promised to bless him. And certainly by the time it happens again, you think he would have learned the lesson, but as we all do, he didn't. They had to have had an exit strategy. But what do we read next? When Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. When Pharaoh's officials saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh. So Abram's wife was taken into the household of Pharaoh, and he did treat Abram well on account of her. Abram received sheep and cattle, male donkeys, male servants, female donkeys, female servants, camels. So, did they think that he was just going to protect her? Did they think that there would be some long, prolonged negotiation process over, what the prospective suitor was going to have to pay in order to strike the deal? And did they think that, well, we can prolong this and at the end we'll just say no and then the famine will be over and we go home? Some commentators think that was their strategy. Maybe with ordinary people, there would be some negotiation process, but the king didn't have to follow those rules, did he? She's cute. Come here. Wasn't any discussion. And what happens? Well, the Lord struck Pharaoh and his household with severe diseases because of Sarai. God had made a promise to Abram. I'm going to bless you. And Abram's disobedience didn't change God's promise. So God intervened, not because of Abram's righteousness. That's the theme here. Now, this part doesn't say how Pharaoh found out. We don't know. Text doesn't say. Maybe he called for Sarai and started talking to her about her background, and she spilled the beans, and he finds out, you're married? And that would explain why everybody in this household's got sickness and disease. And what happens? We see a pagan correcting, rebuking a person of faith. God will do that. God will do that to us sometimes. Now, the next low point incident was this business with Hagar. Let's jump ahead to chapter 16. Now, Sarai, Abram's wife, had not given birth to any children, but she had an Egyptian servant named Hagar. Where do you think they got the Egyptian servant from? Oh, yeah, because they'd gone down to Egypt in the first place. So Sarai said to Abram, since the Lord has prevented me from having children, please sleep with my servant. Perhaps I can have a family by her. Abraham did what Sarai told him. Notice that Abram did not seek the Lord's guidance here. The two of them decide to take matters into their own hands. Next verse. So after Abram had lived in Canaan for 10 years, so they had been in the land for 10 years, no children, Sarai, Abram's wife, gave Hagar, her Egyptian servant, to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar. She became pregnant. Once Hagar realized she was pregnant, she despised Sarai. And I've talked before about the fact that almost certainly Hagar figured, well, I should be the prime wife. I'm the one that's providing a child. So she developed an attitude. Once Hagar realized she was pregnant, she despised Sarai. Then Sarai said to Abram, and this is the part I love the best, you have brought this wrong on me. What did we read 2 verses earlier? Oh, here, take my servant. Oh, you've brought this wrong on me. Yeah. So we, of course, know what happened. Abram, wipes his hands, says, okay, you can do what you want. Sarai starts mistreating her so that she'll leave, which she did. And then the Lord appears to Hagar and says, no, go back. I've got a plan. I'm going to bless you and your child, which he does. But that's another story for another time. Next low point, Abram and Abimelech. Chapter 20. Abraham journeyed from there to the Negev region and settled between Kadesh and Shur. While he lived as a temporary resident in Gerar, Abraham said about his wife, Sarah, "She is my sister." So Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent for Sarah and took her. Now, what happens next? God himself appears to this pagan king and says, "You're as good as dead because of this woman." And then he starts negotiating with God. "But God, I didn't know. He told me she was his sister." God says, "Yeah, I know that. That's why I'm giving you a break here. Do the right thing and all will be fine." So what do we read next? Verse 8. Early in the morning, Abimelech summoned all his servants. When he told them about all these things, they were terrified. They got it. The king's servants understood the magnitude of the situation. Abimelech summoned Abram and said to him, "What have you done to us? What sin did I commit against you that would cause you to bring such great guilt on me and my kingdom? You have done these things to me that should not be done." Then Abimelech asked Abraham, "What prompted you to do this thing?" Abraham replied, "Because I thought, surely no one fears God in this place." Time out. Did God tell Abram, "I'm going to bless you as long as you hang around people who fear me"? Abraham was in the midst of a pagan culture. The promise never said anything about, "Hey, you got to make sure you only hang around people that trust me." Never said that. And then he proceeds to explain the half-truth. "What's more, she is indeed my sister, my father's daughter, but not my mother's daughter." And then goes on to say that this was the deal that they had set up. Remember, a half-truth is a whole lie. And once again, any opportunity for Abram's witness is destroyed because of his behavior. And what happens? Abraham prays to God. God heals Abimelech as well as his wife and female slaves so that they were able to have children. For the Lord had caused infertility to strike every woman in the household of Abimelech because he took Sarah, Abraham's wife. Now, do a little bit of inference from here. How long does it take for you to figure out you're not having children anymore? A few months, doesn't it? Which means Sarah was in the harem, untouched, but she was in the harem for months. That's not where God wanted her to be, I can tell you that. All right, so the last of the three "she's my sister" incidents was Isaac and Rebekah. Genesis chapter 26. There was a famine in the land subsequent to the earlier famine that occurred in the days of Abraham. Isaac went to Abimelech, king of the Philistines at Gerar. The Lord appeared to Isaac and said, "Do not go down to Egypt. Settle down in the land that I will point out to you. Stay in this land, then I will be with you and bless you. For I will give all these lands to you and to your descendants, and I will fulfill the solemn promise I made to your father Abraham. I will multiply your descendants so they will be as numerous as the stars in the sky, and I will give them all these lands. All the nations of the earth will pronounce blessings on one another using the name of your descendants. All this will come to pass because Abraham obeyed me and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws." So Isaac settled in Gerar. Next verse. When the men of that place asked him about his wife, he replied, "She is my sister." He was afraid to say, she is my wife, for he thought to himself, the men of this place will kill me to get Rebekah because she is very beautiful. Now, when Abraham said Sarai was his sister, it was at least a half-truth. It was still a full lie, but it was a half-truth. Isaac was just committing a full lie because there was no truth in it whatsoever. And yet the sin pattern continues. And despite, and I've spoken in the past that the Genesis 22 incident where God calls Abram to sacrifice Isaac, and as I've argued and taught about in the past, Isaac was old enough and big enough to carry the wood for the sacrifice. And I think there's a good argument to be made that he was maybe well into adulthood at this point, which means Isaac was a willing, knowingly, fully cognizant, willing participant in what Abraham was about to do, which meant Isaac had as much faith as Abraham did. And what happens? Abraham's about to kill him. Isaac is going along with this because he trusted his father and God. And what does God do? Don't touch the boy. And he provides the ram for the sacrifice. Isaac was there. He knows what God can do. And yet, his faith faltered. So, after Isaac had been there a long time, under this pretense, Abimelech, king of the Philistines, happened to look out a window and observed Isaac caressing his wife Rebekah. And he didn't take a whole 2 seconds to figure out, that's not the way you touch your sister. Come here, boy. We need to talk. So Abimelech summoned Isaac and said, she really is your wife. Why did you say she's my sister? The third pagan having to rebuke the men of faith. Isaac replied, because I thought someone might kill me to get her. Then Abimelech exclaimed, what in the world have you done to us? One of our men nearly took your wife to bed, and you would have brought guilt on us. So Abimelech commanded all his people, whoever touches this man or his wife will surely be put to death. When Isaac planted it, and then know what happens. So in the wake of Isaac's faltering faith and being called out by a pagan, what do we read next? God abundantly blesses Isaac. What's the next verse? When Isaac planted in that land, he reaped in the same year 100 times what he had sown, because the Lord blessed him. The man became wealthy. His influence continued to grow until he became very prominent. If you keep reading, he's growing so powerful and so wealthy that the Philistines are getting jealous and they're trying to cause trouble and blah, blah, blah. We'll talk about that at a separate time. But the point is that in the wake of this horrible disobedience, God blesses him. Keep that in mind. We're almost done here. So the incident with Jacob stealing the blessing. Chapter 27, verse 5. Now Rebekah had been listening because Isaac was getting old. He couldn't see very well. He thought he might be close to death. He calls in Esau. He says, go out into the country, hunt some wild game, bring it back, prepare it for me. I'm going to eat the wild game, and I'm going to bless you. Rebekah's listening to this, and then she says, hey, Jacob, come here. I got a plan. Go get a goat. I'll prepare it, and bring it in. Chapter 27, verse 5. Now Rebekah had been listening while Isaac spoke to his son Esau. When Esau went out to the open fields to hunt some wild game and bring it back, Rebekah said to her son Jacob, look, I overheard your father tell your brother, bring me some wild game and prepare me some tasty food. Then I'll eat it and bless you in the presence of the Lord before I die. Now then, my son, do exactly what I tell you. Go to the flock, give me 2 of the best young goats. I'll prepare them in a tasty way for your father and just the way he loves them. Then you will take it to your father. Thus he will eat it and bless you before he dies. Now, God had told Rebekah that Jacob would be the favored one, that Esau would serve Jacob. God had told her that. But God didn't tell her that she needed to make sure she used her own wicked techniques to make it happen. Next verse. But Esau, my brother, is a hairy man, Jacob protested to his mother Rebekah, and I have smooth skin. My father may touch me. Then he'll think I'm mocking him, and I'll bring a curse on myself instead of a blessing. So his mother told him, any curse against you will fall on me, my son. Just obey me. Go and get them for me. And of course, that's what he does. So, against this backdrop of all of this significant behavior that's less than what we want to think about, what do we see? And yet, despite all of this, what do we read in the beginning of Exodus? Chapter 1. These are the names of the sons of Israel, goes through the 12 tribes. Let me jump ahead. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died, but the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. Now, what's the point? The point is that God indeed created the nation that he had promised, despite their behavior. So the question is, why? Why did he do that? Deuteronomy chapter 9. They're about to go into the promised land. What does God say? Understand then that it is not because of your righteousness that the Lord your God is giving you this good land to possess, for you are a stiff-necked people. Then, almost 1,000 years later, Ezekiel, they're now in captivity in Babylon. Ezekiel chapter 20. As for you, O house of Israel, thus says the Lord God, go, serve every one of his idols, but later you will surely listen to me. In my holy name you will profane no longer with your gifts and with your idols. For on my holy mountain, on the high mountain of Israel, declares the Lord God, there the whole house of Israel, all of them, will serve me in the land. There I will accept them. There I will seek your contributions and the choicest of your gifts with all your holy things. As a soothing aroma, I will accept you when I bring you out from the peoples and gather you from the lands where you are scattered. I will prove myself holy among you in the sight of the nations, and you will know that I am the Lord. When I bring you into the land of Israel, into the land which I swore to give to your forefathers, there you will remember your ways and all your deeds with which you have defiled yourselves. You will loathe yourselves in your own sight for all the evil things that you have done. Then you will know that I am the Lord when I have dealt with you for my name's sake, not according to your evil ways or according to your corrupt deeds. What's God saying here? I'm going to accomplish my purposes regardless of you. Now, what does all this mean for those of us who are believers? What it means is that we don't have to be perfect. And it's a good thing because we mess up every day. And what these stories are telling us is that God is faithful regardless. And what did Paul tell Timothy? 2 Timothy chapter 2. If we died with him, we will also live with him. If we endure, we will also reign with him. If we deny him, he will deny us. If we are unfaithful, he remains faithful, since he cannot deny himself. When we look at Abraham being asked to sacrifice his son, I think most of us sit back and say, I don't have that kind of faith. And obviously, we're supposed to be growing in our obedience to the Lord. I think when we read about the falterings, those are the ones we can identify with. Those are the ones that's like, yeah, I can see myself doing that. And here's the point. God did the work for us. We're celebrating the table of the Lord tonight. Why? Because Christ sacrificed himself for us. Why? Because we couldn't do it ourselves. God did what we cannot do. We still have a sin nature. We will have a sin nature until either we die or the Lord comes back. God understands that. He asks that we grow in our faith, that we grow in our obedience and understanding, that we grow in our faithfulness. But it is supremely comforting to know that his acceptance of us is not dependent on our behavior. What we do for him will impact our rewards in heaven. We obey him because we love him, because we want to show our love and devotion to someone who has died for us. But we don't obey him because that's going to make him accept us. That's not the way it works. And we don't have to worry about that. So when we go through these incidents throughout the Old Testament, they are a testimony to the fact that even though we may be unfaithful, God always is faithful. He will never leave us or forsake us. And we can take comfort when we mess up. What did John tell us? If we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and cleanse us of all unrighteousness. God's grace is not a floor mat, a place to wipe our feet. That's not the point. It's not the point. We're growing in our devotion to him, but we know that we can trust his promises because he will never deny himself. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for these precious stories you have for us that remind us that you are faithful regardless of our behavior, that we can trust in your promises. We can trust that you have us in the palm of your hands. Praise your holy name. Amen.
Lord, as we go from this place, loving you more, trusting you more, may the power of your love and the light of your word shine forth to a sin-darkened world as we go